ready to go. All right. We're ready to start the recording, Catherine.
Yes, recording has started.
Okay. Hello and welcome back to the 4 books of Confucian learning. So far, we've studied the highest learning, the analects, and the practice of the mean. So this brings us to the Mencius. So today and over the next 4 weeks, what we'll do is we'll explore key passages from the Mencius, last but not least of the 4 books. Now, as Catherine has previously mentioned, there is a lineage that can be traced in the Confucian tradition from the 4 books and their attributed authors. If you look at this diagram, the Analects is traditionally considered to have been compiled by Confucius's students. Now, many of those students went on to teach and or serve in a government office. And some of those students, Confucius, actually became masters in their own right. For example, Zheng Shen, or as we know him, Master Zheng, he had a profound influence on the emerging tradition of Confucian thought. Master Zheng led a large community, a large Confucian community in the state of Lu, with his students, including Confucius's grandson, Zisu. So the highest learning, authorship of the highest learning is traditionally attributed to Master Zheng, and the practice of the mean is attributed to Master Zisu. Now, this lineage of Confucian thought that's been passed down through Master Zheng and Master Zisu came to be led by Mencius in the 4th century, before the Common Era. Now, Mencius is more commonly referred to as Master Meng, or in Chinese, Mengzi, which has been Latinized as Mencius. So, what I'm going to do today is have a brief introduction to Mencius, the philosopher, as well as Mencius, the text, the book that bears his name. And then we'll explore some key passages from the opening chapter of the Mencius. So who was Mencius? Well, numerous narratives surround the life of Mencius, but little is known about him apart from what we can gather from the text itself. Now, Mencius lived in a time known as the Warring States period, and this was during the late Zhou dynasty in ancient China. Mencius came from the state of Zhou, which we can see here is indicated by the red arrow. And it's a small state located at the base of what is now the Shandong Peninsula. It's traditionally thought that Mencius learned from Master Zisu or one of his students. For example, the records of the historian, which provides us with the earliest account of Mencius, states that Mencius received instruction from a follower of Master Zisu. Now, Mencius was born about 100 years after Confucius. Mencius and Confucius never actually met each other, but Mencius came to be recognized as a successor to Confucius and the second sage in the Confucian tradition. He is second only to Confucius himself. Now, by the time of Mencius, the authority and order of the Zhou dynasty had deteriorated. It had declined so much that the king of the Zhou dynasty ruled only in name, and their empire had been divided into many, many different states. Each of those states had its own state ruler. And those state rulers contended with each other for supremacy. Now, the political situation had become increasingly violent and volatile, and the reason is because those states waged war against each other as they struggle for power. And that's why this period in Chinese history is called the Warring States period. Now, it's in this political climate that people looked to scholars and strategists for ideas and strategies on bringing about order and government. In fact, state rulers competed with each other to employ these scholars and strategists in their courts. And it was because of their expertise in the art of statecraft, for example, tax policy, diplomacy, agricultural technology, as well as political and social organisation. They were also sought after for their expertise in warfare, the art of war. Now, Mencius taught and practiced Confucius's teachings, and he spent much of his career traveling from state to state, meeting with different state rulers, and he tried to influence their policies in the hopes of restoring the peace and unity of the past, in hopes of enabling the people to recover the traditional values and rituals that had once made their society strong and humane. Now, Mencius actually developed Confucius's teachings as he sort of defended them in face of competing theories and ideas at the time. And at one point, Mencius was appointed as a high official advising the king in the state of Qi. When he resigned from that role, he retired to his native state of Zhou, where he lived out the rest of his life as a teacher. So we now know a little bit about Mencius as the philosopher. What about Mencius the book? Well, the book purports to record, this is the state of Qi, where you can see it's sort of located in the territory northeast of Zhou and Lu. Zhou is Mencius's native state, and Lu is where Confucius lived. Now, the book called Mencius purports to record the teachings of Mencius, and it includes the conversations that he had with various state rulers, as well as his students, and the debates that he had with other philosophers of the time. The authorship of the Mencius remains unclear. Some traditional accounts claim that it was Mencius himself who composed the text. Others say that it was compiled by his students. What we do know from the book is that Mencius thought that the empire could only be successfully unified by someone who was worthy of the title of king, someone who possessed the moral qualities of a true king. So in many of his conversations with the state rulers of his time, Mencius tries to steer their attention away from the desire for power and more power to a concern for ethical virtue. Now, the book is divided into 7 chapters, and each chapter is divided into 2 parts. As we can see here, on the contents page of a recent translation, English translation by Professor Irene Bloom, we can see there's books 1 to 7, or you'd say chapters 1 to 7, and each book or chapter is divided into parts A and part B. Now, in Chinese, the chapter titles are styled much like on the Analects, where the title is derived from the opening passage of each of those chapters, or the parts of those chapters. Now, this arrangement, 7 chapters, each divided into 2 parts, can be actually traced back to Zhao Qi, who wrote the earliest extant commentary on the Mencius. and he lived in the 3rd century. Zhao Ti had access to an edition of the version that he read, actually comprised of more than 7 chapters. He had the version that he had access to. There were 7 inner documents and 4 outer documents. And Zhao Ti found that the 4 outer documents actually bore very little resemblance to the inner documents. And so he removed the 4 outer documents, leaving the 7 inner documents. And then he further divided those 7 documents into 2 parts each. And that's how we have the structure of the Mencius that we read today. Now, according to Zhao Ti, the Mencius in the Han Dynasty actually appointed official scholars known as erudites to teach the text called Mencius. They also taught texts like the Analects and the Classic of Family Reverence that we've also heard about. But during this time, and including his time in the later Han Dynasty, right up to the early Tang Dynasty in, let's say, the 7th, 8th centuries, Mencius, the book, was very much categorized among the philosophical writings, what we call the writings of the masters. It wasn't quite a canonical or a classic text as such, but thanks to the efforts of official scholars like Han Yu, Liao, and others, they advocated for this text, the Mencius, to be a central resource in the revival of Confucian thought. And during their time in the Tang Dynasty, Confucian thought had fallen into relative neglect as in light of the contemporary interest in Buddhist and Taoist teachings. So thanks to their efforts, Mencius, the philosopher, was recognized as, you could say, the true successor of Confucius. And early on in the Song Dynasty, the text called Mencius numbered among the 11 classics that were inscribed in stone. So it was certainly by the early Song Dynasty, well before Zhu compiled the Mencius as part of the 4 books, that Mencius was already recognized as a classic of the Confucian tradition of thought. Zhu himself wrote a very influential commentary that I've listed out here. And in the Qing Dynasty, Jiao Xun also wrote a very authoritative commentary called the Orthodox Interpretation of the Mencius. Now, there's been scholarship and on the Mencius, as well as translations of the Mencius. Here, I've listed out most of the English translations of the Mencius. You can see sort of starting from the 18th century with the Jesuit father Francois Noël. He published in Latin an early translation of the Mencius as part of a set of books called the 6 Books of the Chinese Empire. In Latin, it included the other texts of the 4 books, as well as the Classic of Family Reverence, all in Latin. On the next slide, I've listed some of the books in roughly the last 20 years. Now, you can see this is sort of scholarship on the Mencius, the text, in terms of moral philosophy. There's even a gender theory study, as well as comparative studies as well. And I draw your attention to essays on the moral philosophy of Mencius, which provides quite a comprehensive picture of the moral philosophy in this text. In theorizing Confucian virtue politics, the political philosophy of Mencius and Xunzi that also provides what he would say a systematic philosophical account of both the thought of Mencius and Xunzi. And just earlier this year, Oxford University Press published Franklin Perkins' Introduction to the Philosophy of Mencius. So these are just some of the books. There's obviously countless articles and book chapters related to the Mencius as philosopher, and Mencius the book, the text. Now, today, in the next 4 weeks, we'll be exploring key passages, and our discussion of those passages will be informed by these 3 commentaries by Sun Shi and Zhu Xi from the Song Dynasty, as well as Jiao Xun in the Qing Dynasty. And the orthodox interpretation of the Mencius also includes Zhao Ti's commentary too. So without further ado, we'll take a look at the first chapter. And I've chosen the first chapter because, like so many of the traditional texts, the opening chapter, especially the opening parts of the first chapter, certainly provides the core messages, key themes, sort of what you most need to take away from this particular text, if that is all that you can remember. So this is the very first passage from the opening chapter. Mencius had an audience with King Hui of Liang. The king said, "Venerable sir, you've not considered it too far to come here from 1,000 li away. Surely you have some means to benefit our state." Now, Mencius has travelled to the state of Wei, and he is invited to an audience with the state ruler, who is recorded here as King Hui of Liang. Now, you might be wondering why the king of the state of Wei is, referred to here as the king of Liang. Well, actually, King Hui was known during his lifetime as Prince Ying of the state of Wei. And I think it was in the 361 before the Common Era, he moved his capital to Daliang, right here. And he thereafter became known as the Prince Ying of Liang. Now, having ruled for several decades, he became posthumously titled as Hui, so King Hui of Liang. And according to the rituals of the Zhou dynasty, this posthumous title of Hui signifies that he had been judged as someone who loved his people. So Mencius has an audience with the king. The king addresses Mencius as "Venerable Sir." This sort of form of address would be, generally reserved for someone of the age of the king's father. So from this form of address, we can tell that Mencius was probably in his older years. "You've not considered it too far to come here from 1,000 li away." Now, li is a Chinese unit of linear measurement. It's about 500 meters, or 1/3 of a mile. So 1,000 li is about 500 kilometers. Why would Mencius want to travel so far? If you can imagine, interstate travel in those days was not only difficult, it was also dangerous. Well, Mencius hoped to influence the king to benefit the people in the state of Wei. It was an extremely important state, and its king, its ruler, King Hui, ruled for several decades. He was an extremely influential figure. So Mencius wanted to benefit the people in the state of Wei through his advice to the king, helping the king to understand and achieve good government. Now, the king begins with, well, actually, this is the only statement or question he has for Mencius in this passage. Surely you have some means to benefit our state. If you can understand, at the time, other states, neighbouring states, say, left, they had grown in economic strength and military capacity through the expertise of their advisors, their political advisors. And so, in fact, the commentaries tell us that one of the reasons why the king in the state of Wei decides to move his capital to Daliang, which is indicated by the arrow on the right, is because of this increasing dominant presence of the state of Qin. So you can see, Daliang's about as far as you can get away from their border with the state of Qin. So the king is hoping that maybe Mencius has some new innovative ideas that might assist him and his state in the same way that the state of Qin has benefited from its political advisors. And so sort of from the very outset, he wants to know, surely we must have some benefit, some means to profit my state. Now, Mencius is very clear about what the king has in mind, and Mencius immediately explains the downsides, the disbenefits to the blind pursuit of benefit in terms of material gain, material advantage, and the fact that there are really no quick fixes. So this is what Mencius says. Your Majesty, why must you speak of benefit? I have nothing more than teachings of humanity and rightness. If the king says, how can I benefit my state? The high officers will say, how can I benefit my family? And the officials and commoners will say, how can I benefit myself? Those above and those below will compete with one another for benefit, and the state will be imperiled. So Mencius points out that if everyone thought like King Wei, well, everyone, tries to take advantage of each other, then the state is bound to be in danger. And Mencius goes on to elaborate why that is the case. How would the state be in danger? The state with 10,000 chariots. The one who assassinates his lord will be from a family with 1,000 chariots. In a state with 1,000 chariots, the one who assassinates his lord will be from a family of 100 chariots. To have 1,000 out of 10,000 or 100 out of 1,000 is not an inconsiderable share. But when the rightness is subordinated to profit, the urge to lay claim to more becomes irresistible. So how would the state be in danger? Well, at the time, the chariot was a vehicle that was used for military purposes. And the number of chariots served as an indicator for the military capability, the military strength. So in accordance with the rules of ritual, the king of the empire, the Zhou king, had 10,000 chariots. His relatives were the hereditary lords. They were responsible for various regions in the empire. Well, they had 1,000 chariots, 1/10. And their high officials, they had 100 chariots. So Mencius is saying that those who commit political assassinations, they already have 1/10 of their immediate superiors' total chariots. Yet they seek to gain more power, more territory, and more population. Unfortunately, this wasn't just a hypothetical argument. And we know this because during the spring and autumn period that sort of preceded the warring states period I mentioned before, you have texts like the Zuo tradition of commentary on the spring and autumn annals that records several high officials murdering, assassinating their state rulers. So it was a very real concern. We can imagine that on a micro level, let's say the members of a family are solely preoccupied with wealth, property, inheritance. If they tried to take advantage of each other, well, the whole family could fall apart. And when we consider that, the king asks just the one question of Mencius about, and it's all about material gains. What can you do to benefit my state? Drawsey's commentary points to the potential for even a slight deviation in the state's priorities to have extensive consequences. And Drawsey quotes from the 11th century philosopher Master Chong to clarify that the exemplary person, well, they do desire material gains, financial profit, but they're conscious of the harm in making profit and material gain their sole objective. Now, Mencius continues to say, it has never happened in humanity and his parents, but when given to rightness, subordinates the interests of his lord. Let the king speak only of humanity and rightness. Why must he speak of benefit? So Mencius argues that there's really no need to focus on material gain and profit because those economic rewards and financial benefits, they arise naturally when the ruler and his people cultivate the root causes for those gains, and the real causes being humanity and rightness. So Mencius points out that a person who cultivates humanity and rightness would not neglect to serve their parents or their ruler. And we see that Mencius uses repetition, not only to reinforce the key message, why must you speak of benefit, but also to get King Hui to think again, to rethink his current policy. Now, the historian, it's interesting because countless scholars have read and studied the Mencius over the years. Among them is the historian Sima Tian, who is famous for his magnum opus, The Records of the Historian. And Sima Tian, he his Records of the Historian. He says that, when he reads the Mencius, he can barely get past the first few pages. And the reason is because he reads up to the question from King Hui, how can you profit my state? And it makes him throw the book away. He feels so depressed, as a historian, he's researched history, he's seen it all, but it's so depressing that people always think about, what's in it for me? This is the first thing on their mind when it should really be the last. Because as Sima Tian reasons, such material profit, material gain is truly the root cause of social disorder. And the disadvantages of seeking profit is the same for everyone, regardless of whether they're the king of the empire or the person on the street. So Sima Tian also observes that Mencius seldom mentions material gain himself, and Sima Tian thinks this is for preventative purposes. Now, according to Zhao, this opening passage is all about the art of bringing about order. Not just about governance, but bringing about order in the life of the state and in the life of individuals and their families too. It all starts with humanity and rightness, because through the education of such ethical virtue, it generates harmony and mutual respect between all the individuals involved, whether they're the ones who lead or the people being led. I remember that when I was at university, it was my first year, and I was buying some secondhand books from a more senior student. They were in the year above me. And this is just to give an everyday example of humanity and rightness. But I remembered that through the textbooks that I would need in the coming semester. And I was going to, pay, I think it was $80 for the third book, but she wouldn't sell it to me. She told me that there was be a new edition coming out. So she just gave me the third book for my own reference in the meantime. And, I thought to myself, well, if she didn't tell me, I wouldn't have known. I would have, happily handed over $80 for the other book. But she put herself in my position, as full-time students. We don't have a full-time income yet. And I still remember her kind and positive example as a senior student. And I'm grateful for that to this day. So I think that it's very clear from the opening passage that the proper way of bringing about order is through the education and cultivation of humanity and rightness. Instead of being chiefly concerned with seeking profit and material gains, the ruler and their government really should be teaching people to develop humanity and rightness. So everyone understands their roles and their responsibilities, and they can live and work together in harmony. Harmony is, after all, the foundation for all success. Now, you could say that education has to start with the ruler, because in the traditional context, those in positions of leadership have a moral duty to set the right example. The king is a role model in how he thinks and what he does. And the common assumption is that people will generally follow the lead set by their superiors. So there are flow-on effects for the king's family, for the officials at his court, for everyone in his state if the king fails to cultivate their ethical character. If the king himself tries to take advantage of others, well, his subordinates and his subjects will imitate him, and there'll be dangerous consequences for everyone. Now, if you think about it, it's actually the king who has the most to lose. And the pursuit of humanity and rightness obviously makes sense from in terms of Confucian theory, but it's also prudent policy. And this is sort of implied in Mencius's argument, because, if the king emphasizes humanity and rightness, leads the people to practice humanity and rightness, well, the population, the people, won't, resort to political assassination of their ruler or, try to depose him for no good reason. So what is core to bringing about order is this education in humanity and rightness. And it starts with the state leader setting the right example and not focusing just on the material advantage and material gains. Okay, in the next passage, we see Mencius again trying to help King Hui understand, what it takes for good government, and using specific historical examples for the king to reflect on himself. Let's take a look. Mencius had another audience with King Hui of Liang. As the king stood by a pond, watching the geese and deer, he said, "Do the virtuous also enjoy these things?" So the king is wanting to show off his imperial park to Mencius. The commentaries tell us that park is a place located away from farmland, specifically designed for the rearing of birds and animals. Now, in Chinese, there are actually two species, two types of geese and deer named, and it sort of implies that there's a wide variety of animals in the king's park. So sort of no wonder he wants to show off this park to Mencius. Now, Mencius replies very cryptically. He says, "Only the virtuous are really able to enjoy those things. Those who are not virtuous, although they might have such things, cannot really enjoy them." Now, what does he mean? Well, Mencius is invoking the idea that only a virtuous person can enjoy such things because they enjoy them with others. They share their happiness with others. A ruler who doesn't share his joy with their people will not be able to indulge their sort of selfish pleasures for long. In fact, Mencius explains by referring to two historical rulers. There's a positive example in King Wen of the Zhou dynasty, who we've come across many times before, and a negative example in King Jie of the Xia dynasty. And Mencius refers to those historical examples by quoting from two authoritative texts. There is the Classic of Odes, which is a collection of poems, and the Classic of Documents. So Mencius says, it is said, this is a poem about King Wen. King Wen began by measuring the marvelous tower. He measured it out and planned it. The people worked on it, and in less than a day completed it. In beginning to measure, he urged against haste, but the multitudes came as if they were his children. The king was in the marvellous park. The does lay down. The does were sleek. The white birds glistened. The king was by his marvellous pond. How full it was with dancing fish. So from this poem, or this part of the poem, we know that when King Wen was planning his tower, the people came forward enthusiastically to build it for him. He didn't want to burden the people unnecessarily, so told them to take their time. But what did they do? They finished it before the day was out, well before the planned time for completion. Now, we also get a sense of what the creatures were like in the park. The does were pregnant and settled on the ground, that healthy, well-fed, with a sleek fur. And we know that deers are creatures who, by their very nature, tend to be startled very easily. They run away in the presence of people. But in the park, the does are content to remain where they are. The birds in the air are also healthy, well-fed, with feathers that shine. And in the waters, the pond is teeming with fish who leap out as if dancing for joy. So you get the image of there's a whole atmosphere of health and happiness, and it seems that all the living beings are well taken care of, from the people who happily respond to serve their king to the creatures that inhabit the imperial park. Now, Mencius points out that King Wen relied on the labours of the people to build his tower and his pond, and yet the people rejoiced in the work. It was the people that called his tower the Marvellous Tower, and the pond the Marvellous Pond, and they rejoiced in his having all of those creatures. Now, what was his secret, and how did he come to be so loved and respected? Well, Mencius points out that these ancient sage rulers like King Wen, they shared their joys with the people, and it was this that enabled them to feel joy. King Wen actually shared his imperial park with the people who could make use of its resources, as we'll read in a later passage. Now, in contrast, Mencius also provides an example of the despotic last ruler of the Xia dynasty, King Jie. From the chapter called Declaration of Tongue in the classical documents. O son, when will you expire? We will die along with you. Now, a complete change in tone. The people suffered in misery under the tyrannical reign of King Jie, and they were so anxious to see the end of Jie that they would rather die than live another day. Under his regime, death seemed preferable to their miserable existence. And, King Jie certainly had towers and ponds and birds and animals, but any selfish pleasure he had was short-lived because he lost the support of the people and came to be overthrown by Tongue. That's why the chapter is called the Declaration of Tongue. And Tongue went on to to establish the Shang dynasty. Now, Jie likened himself to the sun for being, the unchallengeable constant. And he thought he would rule forever. And that's why the people say, "Oh, sun," when they are referring to King Jie. Now, Zhou draws our attention to the virtue of the sage ruler, King Wen, who shares his happiness with the people and cares for even the birds and animals too. And in return, he's loved and respected. And everyone benefits from the peace and prosperity and, I suppose, education in King Wen's selfless example. Now, in contrast, a benighted ruler like King Jie causes widespread resentment and anger and bitterness, and they lose the support of the people, which precipitates the end of their rulership and whatever happiness they might have enjoyed. So you could say that the imperial park serves as a microcosm of the rest of the state. A ruler can only really enjoy the park and enjoy sovereignty over the state for as long as they're responsible in caring for the inhabitants of the park and in serving the people of their state. Now I want to look at another passage, and we'll jump a little bit to, this is the second passage of the chapter. And this involves a different king from a different state, looking at King Xuan of Qi. But it's also about the imperial park, and it helps us further understand how King Wen shared his park with the people. So King Xuan of Qi asked Mencius, "Is it true that King Wen's park was 70 square li?" Mencius replies, "Well, it is stated in the records." The king asked, "Was it as large as that?" Mencius replied, "The people still considered it small." The king says, "My park is 40 square li, and yet the people consider this large. Why is this?" Now, Mencius, elsewhere in the book, tells us that the King Wen's territory was only 100 square li, and his imperial park was 70 square li, so it took up 70% of the territory of his state. Now, King Xuan of Qi, his state is 1,000 square li, and his park is only 40 square li. So you can understand why the king has this question in his mind and why he raises this with Mencius. Why do the people think my park is too large? Well, Mencius replies, so King Wen's park of 70 square li was frequented by the gatherers of fodder and firewood and by the hunters of pheasants and rabbits. He shared it with the people. It is only natural that they should have considered it small, is it not? Now, Mencius's response really highlights the issues. The first issue is that King Xuan's park is strictly for his exclusive enjoyment. This contrasts with King Wen's park that was shared with the people. They could visit as often as they liked. They visited frequently, in fact, to hunt and to gather. Hunt for pheasants and rabbits, and to gather fodder, which is straw and hay for their animals, and firewood for fuel. So as the ruler has a moral duty to care for the people as their father and mother, one would expect the ruler to care about what the people need. But it seems that King Xuan is only thinking about, having the park to himself, and he's not really that interested in using the land and its resources for the needs of the people. So Mencius goes on to point out to the king further problems with his current policy. He says, "When I first arrived at the borders of your state, I inquired before daring to enter about its major prohibitions, what you're not allowed to do in the state. I heard that within the passes there is a park of 40 square li, where the crime of killing a deer is considered equivalent to the crime of killing a human being. Since this 40 square li is a trap in the middle of the state, it's only natural that the people consider it large, is it not?" So, the second issue with King Wen's state is that the laws are overly harsh. Not only do the people miss out on any benefits that King Xuan's park might have, but they stand to suffer serious penalties. You can imagine that if even one of the park animals is harmed, the human individual would have committed a crime, and they might even be sentenced to death. So Mencius is trying to tell the king that the legal regulations in the state are overly harsh. And the third issue is that not only do the people lose out on any of the benefits that the park might have to offer, they have to suffer the threat of serious penalties and punishments should they cause harm to the animals. But the so-called park is really an ongoing liability for them. It might be a leisure park for the king, but it's really a dangerous trap, a snare, right in the middle of the state, their state. So the bottom line here is that it's just wrong for King Xuan to be thinking just about his exclusive enjoyment of the park. And King Wen actually shared the use of his park with the people so they could go there to hunt and gather for their own needs. And Mencius is emphasizing that as a state leader, the king should be thinking about the needs of his people. What do they need to maintain their livelihoods? And with the principle being that, the public interest must come before private amusements. Now, on a high level, you could say that this passage goes one step further in questioning whether the king is really doing everything that he can for his people. It seems that King Wen enjoyed a park, had a tower, a pond, animals, but he thought about the people in his spare time and shared all of those resources with them. So what is King Hui and King Xuan doing in their spare time? And who do they think of most of the time? Is it themselves, or is it the people that they're responsible for? And it's not just about them. If we ask ourselves, what do we think about most? And what do we do with our spare time? I think there's plenty of food for thought. Now, we'll go to the next passage, the third passage of the opening chapter. And we come back to King Hui of Liang. Now, King Hui of Liang says to Mencius, I, the solitary man, devotes his entire mind to the state. When there is drought within the river, I transfer people to the east of the river and transfer grain to the area within the river. When there is drought to the east of the river, again, I act accordingly. Look into the governments of the neighboring states. There is no one as mindful as I, and yet people in the neighboring states do not decrease, nor do my people increase. And why is this? Now, solitary man is the translation of the Chinese term guaren, which literally means a lonely, friendless person. And it was used by rulers to refer to themselves, implying a sense of humility, self-deprecation. The king tells Mencius that he's tried to think of everything to bring benefit to his people. And he gives the example of famine relief. In times of famine, he transports the grain to the areas of need and helps move the people elsewhere. Now, based on this example, he considers himself to be more concerned about the people than the other rulers. And he expects, therefore, that the people from neighboring states will be drawn to the state of Wei, his state. But that is not the case. There's actually, in fact, no change to his population nor the population of the other states. Now, what does Mencius say? Mencius explains to the king using an analogy involving warfare, because he knows that the king is fond of war. So the king is fond of war, so please allow an analogy that derives from war. Drums rumbling, the soldiers having crossed weapons, some then flee, abandoning their armour and trailing their weapons behind them. Some stop after 100 paces, and some after 50 paces. How would it be if those who ran only 50 paces were to laugh at those who ran 100 paces? In the past, soldiers on the battlefield, they would advance to the sound of the drum. And in the scenario described by Mencius, some of the soldiers run away. Some run 50 paces, others run 100 paces. So Mencius asks the king to consider if those who run 50 paces are justified in laughing at those who run the further distance of 100 paces. And as you would expect, the king considers both sets of deserters the same. They've all run away. Now, Mencius explains that, well, if the king understands this, there's no reason to expect the people to be more numerous in your state than, the neighboring states. The king understands that his way of governing is really not all that different from the other rulers. Although the king is providing famine relief, he continues to wage war just like the other rulers. And warfare causes, obviously, a lot of suffering and death among the people. So he can't actually expect people to flock to his state. And Mencius goes on to explain, what are the basics of kingship, good governance, what's involved? Well, number one, ensuring people have time to farm their land instead of being burdened by military conscription, being forced to serve in the army, or labour conscription, so being forced to work on projects, public projects, like extending the palace, for example. And, if they have that time, they're not interrupted from their planting, growing and harvesting their crops, which happens during the seasons of spring, autumn, summer and autumn, that means that the people can grow enough food to support themselves. If fine nets that catch the smaller fish, the smaller turtles, if they're banned from the pools and ponds, it means that there will be a sustainable supply of fish and turtles. And by limiting the wood cutting to the seasons, appropriate seasons, and that would be just winter and autumn when there's no more new growth, there'll be more than enough timber available. Now, with more than enough basic resources, food and timber, people can go about their lives without bitterness. They can feed their families. They have timber to build their houses, to make the coffins to bury their dead. And so they have no resentment. And this is just about taking care of the most basic essentials of good government. This is just for starters. Mencius then goes on to elaborate about what more needs to be done. So he has further recommendations. Households of 5 more and 1 more. It's a unit of measurement, it's about 1/6 of an acre. So households of an acre, they're mulberry trees planted. Well, people of 50 years of age and upwards will be able to be clothed in silk. And it means people in the past would grow mulberry trees for the mulberry leaves, and the leaves would be used to feed silkworms, which would generate silk for making cloth and garments. So there'd be enough clothes so that people wouldn't need to suffer the cold. In the raising of chickens, pigs, dogs, and swine, if people don't neglect the appropriate breeding times, well, people of 70 years of age and upwards will be able to eat meat. Now, people in the past ate meat only occasionally, and it was generally for the benefit of the elders. Now, with fields of 100 more, if the people are not, if their farming activities are not disrupted by military or labour conscription, well, families will be able to grow enough to support themselves. Then attending carefully to the education provided in the schools, ensuring that they include instruction in family reverence and fraternal respect. That would mean that grey-haired people, the elderly, would not be seen carrying burdens by themselves on the roads. So by ensuring that there is education in family reverence and fraternal respect, means that people will understand, how to be dutiful to their family members, including their parents and siblings. And caring for others obviously starts from those closest to us, but certainly extends beyond the family. And so the young and strong will then know to care for the elderly, And so the elderly won't be seen having to carry heavy burdens by themselves. So good leadership involves a little bit more than just famine relief or disaster relief. And Mencius is explaining that a true king would be responsible enough to ensure and plan ahead, so that young and old have enough to eat, clothes to wear, they don't need to suffer from cold and hunger. And then Mencius turns to the situation at hand. He makes all of these recommendations. But what is the situation like at the moment? Well, Mencius points out that people are starving to death. Many have already died from starvation and their bodies are lying by the roadside. And yet grain is not being distributed from the state granaries. And the king's dogs and pigs, they're being fed food intended, that should be for humans. When people die, the king simply blames the drought, feels no personal responsibility. And so Mencius criticizes the king for this attitude, because it's no different from stabbing someone and then blaming the weapon. If the king stops blaming the drought and actually resolves the terrible conditions in the state, then everyone would be drawn to live there. And Mencius tells the king that he needs to do more for the welfare of the people. Proper rulership starts with providing for the basic essentials like food, timber, other resources, but it has to include education so that people know how to conduct themselves as responsible human beings. And it's one thing for the king to say that he's got everything that he can do to help the people. But it seems from Mencius's words that the king has to take responsibility and show the people that he actually cares. So we know from these opening passages that there must be education in ethical virtues like humanity and rightness. Bringing about order means really caring about what others need and sharing everything that we have with others, whether it's our time or so on that. I will finish this talk with Mencius. I look forward to sharing more of the Mencius with you over the next 4 weeks. So thank you very, very much. And I look forward to you again next week. Thank you.